you for these attentive students that have stuck through this very difficult topic throughout the weeks. Lord, we pray for wisdom and discernment that we take from this class as we're able to go out into the world and learn how to confront the culture, and also in the same time to be able to proclaim your gospel to a culture that is so hostile to your holiness, Lord, so much so that they transform you into a God of their own making, Lord. We pray this in your holy name. Amen. All right, so finally the last class, and we, for once, don't have a cavalcade of definitions to go through. We've gone through all the definitions. We've made our case for the genealogy of all of these strange theories that we're living through in this day and age as being just a new manifestation of an old heresy that has plagued the church since time immemorial. Now we're actually going to learn how to counter this in our walk here. And then you're going to understand why all those previous 9 weeks were necessary before we finally got up to any apologetical meat to put on these dry bones of critical theory and cultural Marxism. Okay. And the reason is most of our work here is going to be discernment, learning when we have people coming into an organization trying to transform it from within, trying to subvert it from within, learning the secret language that they use, and also learning how to convince others of the danger that is inherent in these activists as they come in the door. So with that being said, I'm going to lead us in with a little scripture here. For such men are false apostles, deceitful workmen, disguising themselves as apostles of Christ. And no wonder, for even Satan disguises himself as an angel of light. So it is no surprise if his servants also disguise themselves as servants of righteousness. Their end will correspond to their deeds. And that's out of 2 Corinthians. And then also, beloved, do not believe every spirit, but test the spirits to see whether they are from God, for many prophets have gone out into the world. That's from 1 John. And once again, this is for purposes of discernment. Do you want to give Harry some handouts, please? Thank you for coming, Harry. All right, so as I was telling everybody, we're going to finally be dealing with some apologetics in this class after the 9 weeks of building the case for this class. All right, and just a quick definition. I know we've been through enough definitions, but we also have some people following us on YouTube, some of the church members who can't make it, and some people who are just joining us. So I wanted to give a definition of woke, and their definition is the notion of getting woke or staying woke is defined as being acutely aware of racial and social injustice, not just awareness and acknowledgement of isolated incidents, but awareness from a position of understanding systemic and institutional racism. The notion of getting woke encapsulates the first stage of becoming an accomplice in addressing the system of racism. White accomplices should strive to be woke enough not to call themselves woke, and instead strive to embody the state of being by building with people of color, being in a perpetual state of learning, and be woke enough to know you're never woke enough. And then more of the critique of their definition. So in brief, woke means having awakened to having a particular type of critical consciousness, as these are understood within critical social justice. To a first approximation, being woke means viewing society through various critical lenses, as defined by various critical theories bent in service of an ideology most people currently call social justice. That is, being woke means having taken on the worldview of critical social justice, which sees the world only in terms of unjust power dynamics and the need to dismantle problematic systems. That is, it means having adopted theory and the worldview it conceptualizes. And I think we've talked long enough to have an understanding that a worldview is essentially synonymous with the word religion as it has been commonly known throughout the era. So, and if you all have stuck through this class 10 weeks, you already know the backstory, so I'm not going to belabor you all anymore on that. But to go back over the woke worldview, so first we have to deal with their knowledge principle. We can only have knowledge of reality, but not its true nature. And what we think we know about reality is merely socially constructed. We went through that fairly extensively in the first parts of the class. The power principle An oppressor group constructs knowledge to dominate oppressed groups by the rules of language. And now a new one, the subject principle. Individuals are fundamentally defined by their group identity, and this identity is socially constructed. So the main premises of all woke worldviews is reality is socially constructed through the language we use. And that's something I really was lamenting the other day, that I really didn't give you all a good bridge between, as we saw in that previous video, the concept of deconstruction. So the idea of language being a structure, and then some who say that only refers to itself, and some say that don't refer to anything, and the author being taken out of the system. I really didn't bridge that gap between how that became and then the ideas of how reality can be socially constructed. Hopefully one of these days, if you all want to pick my brain on that, I'll be available for you for that. But then also I think there was another bridge between the Gnostic tradition, last week's, the Gnostic tradition and everything that's going on within post-humanism and the sort. I don't know if you all bridge that gap. So that was a little aside there. So, all right. And we're doing a little quick bounce through just to get up to speed here for the apologetical portion. So this will go really quick. The woke ethos, so it's their moral system. It is, one, morally imperative that one should oppose oppression. Two, this has been replaced with the notion that if you are not actively opposing oppression, you are complicit in the oppression. And then three, this is based on the assumption that the system of oppression is the fundamental aspect of society. So no matter what, there's no way that you can be a non-oppressor. So in some way or form, you're going to be, as would be, Ibram Kendi would say, there's no such thing as a non-racist. There's racist and anti-racist. So unless you're openly opposing the system, you are a racist. And we have some of this in our handouts, but I wanted to go through some of these issues. One of the most fundamental thing about the woke phenomenon is it works exactly the same way as cults work, in that they are initiate societies. All Gnostic religions are, in essence, cult-based, in that you are initiated through certain rituals, through secret knowledge and the sort. So the first thing when you're approaching the woke is realize that you're dealing with basically a cult indoctrination. And in essence, you would have to go through, for the woke individual, your apologetic would be parallel to a cult deprogramming. And that's something we don't have the time for in this class. So I just wanted to be able to lay the groundwork for the main part of our apologetic isn't the woke activist. It's going to be everybody else that the woke activist is trying to actively transform through their methodology. So I wanted to read this. Cult indoctrinations tend to follow very predictable stages. First, there's an initiation, then there's an indoctrination, and then there's reprogramming. Wokeness is a cult. It might even be, in its broadest functions, a proper religion with a describable and fanatical cult element. Anti-racism, in particular, under its auspices, is explicitly framed religiously and with clear patterns of cult initiation written all over it. And the processes of cult initiation starts with exploiting a core vulnerability, where the vulnerability is often deliberately inflamed or manufactured for the purpose of doing a cult initiation, where would-be indoctrinators ask manipulative questions and try to catch people on the spot in a feeling of discomfort that is usually rooted in their morality and sense of being a good or adequate person. And the sample questions are, don't you know you're complicit in racist systems, or your objection to being called a racist is your white fragility? And they also try to resolve the vulnerability with woke doctrine. So they first give you the problem, then they try to give you the solution, and that's the dialectic in action. The cult doctrine is introduced as a way to resolve the emotional distress brought on by the vulnerability. As they would state, be an anti-racist, help us dismantle the system and build a better world. And to continue, the cult indoctrinator makes the mark feel morally welcome and good now that they're doing the right thing, where they were doing the wrong thing beforehand, and they would state, you're on the right side of history. And then they will deepen the doctrine while informing their mark that they will be surrounded by temptation, especially from broader society. This is the surest first sign that occult initiation has taken place. It is when this warning starts being applied to friends and family who will be described as failing to understand the depth and value of the cult's doctrine, and, in that fact, the mark themselves, by claiming that they're all white supremacists. And then, to continue with their indoctrination, they would deepen the commitment to the cult by their methods, which include public pronouncements of faith before the in-group community, which is very religious in its practice, which bonds the mark to them socially and emotionally, and sunk costs, that would be more like social costs. This will also involve rituals such as group prayers, singing, or outright initiation rituals, which dramatically deepen commitment to a group very quickly. There will also be requests to make costly personal sacrifices to be considered a full part of the new group. When the mark is sufficiently committed to begin uncritically consuming massive quantities of the cult's doctrine, they're well into the indoctrination phase. They lose all trust in the outsiders. So it's the concept of doing the work, and anti-racism is a lifelong commitment to ongoing processes, self-reflection, self-critique, and social activism. And that comes from Robin DiAngelo's book. And then the reprogramming stage is an us versus them worldview. Cult indoctrinators now try to make the mark's thinking get completely in line with the view of the world described by the cult doctrine. This will let the mark see the truth of the religion for themselves everywhere in the world. That's being woke. And the cult of woke, the mark now has a critical consciousness and is able to see problematics in everything. This includes in speech, writing, institutions, thoughts, people, systems, knowledge, history, one's past, and society itself. Society is broken into different groups or classes, which is social group identity, that are oppressive on one side and oppressed on the other, and in conflict over this. That is conflict theory's belief, is the belief that the different social groups in society are always in conflict with one another for power and dominance, and that rather than working together in complex dynamical ways that can be mutually beneficial, they are at war. And this is, once again, out of, I do believe this is Robin DiAngelo's book. The question is not, did racism take place, but rather, how did racism manifest itself in that situation? No. All right, so I'm not going to go through a lot of these handouts, as we do have a lot. I printed you all on handouts on the more deep issues going on with what I would consider the woke religion, or even in dealing with them and being able to see their methodologies in action. So that's why I printed out these handouts for you to be able to refer to after class. But so we have different audiences for our apologetics here. So I have, first off, the woke, which I call the priest class, and those are the initiates. You're probably not going to have any effect on them in any of your work. They're going to be completely taken in by the system. Your only way of being able to work with them would be as a one-on-one relationship that you have to build over a good amount of time and a good amount of trust, but you're not going to be dealing with them mainly in any kind of social situation, and they would be very defensive even if you tried. And then the next group is the woke proximate. I call them the laity. They're also within the initiation process, so there is some hope to be able to work with them, even though they are probably completely smitten with the worldview. They can be argued away. And we're going to go through that process later in class. Then we have the opportunists. These are people who are just going with the flow, people who just want to be able to maintain their job and their kids' school, so on and so forth. These are going to be the main people that you're going to be focusing with in the apologetics. Okay, so we also have woke dissidents. These, well, if you're in this class, that's you. And these are going to be the people who are already active in working against the program. The latent dissidents are the anti-woke, who, for whatever purpose, aren't active. They probably make their opinions known in private, but they make good partners in working against this. That would be recruited from whether in the church, or your workplace, or your school, so on and so forth. And then the uninitiated, the naive traditionalists, as I call them, are people who have no clue that any of this is even going on and just think that it's just oddities of the modern era. So If this looks very much like a, a recruitment for a spy network, there is a lot of parallels. And that's one of the things I actually did a long paper in my undergraduate on how much the early Christian church functioned as a, as a spy network within, say, like, Cold War statecraft. I'm going to skip past those charts. Y'all can look into them later. I mean, if you wanted me to go over them really quick, but I will. So what this is, for your purpose, we don't have time to read through it, and I don't want you all squinting too much. If you want a large picture of it, I'll email you this stuff so you can blow it up. But it basically, this is a breakdown of woke as a religion. I know I just did 9 classes in demonstrating that woke is of a specific religious tendency, but here is actually their theology charted out in a systematic fashion.
Because this is too tiny.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I didn't know if we had a paper big enough to print this on when I got here today, but I'll give you all a digital copy, and I'll even, if y'all want to blow this up and read it at your heart's content, but it takes every single issues that we deal with, original sin, guilt, mythologies, the sacred, the elect, their beliefs, taboos, rituals, and so on and so forth. Okay, so I want to get situated here because I'm bouncing between both the book and my notes. And this is one of the few classes where we're not going to have, as I said, look, we just have a few words here, not a big old thing I'm going to be going off on here. So I'm going to be ad-libbing a lot of this class. So I'm sorry. I'm just appreciating. I'm sorry. I'm probably going to stumble over my words here a lot. Okay, so and this is based on the book. So what we're going here is the key concepts of wokecraft. And this is mainly what we're going to be covering first is how the critical social justice advocate's going to be working when they come into an organization. So what they look for are different situations where they can have an impact. So these are typically going to be kind of like committees, any kind of councils. If you're at work, they're going to be your different meetings where they can have some sort of effect. Most workplaces now have affinity groups specifically for these ideas, where you may even have like something at your work where you have say a sports appreciation group where they would even try to approach within that concept. But it has to be some sort of a meeting where people are getting together where they start their work. Next is the site of oppression. These are going to be in, whether they're physical locations like your work or whatever, but they're also going to be in, like say, writing curriculum for your kids' schools. They're going to be trying to put out media content to the world, what your organization represents. Then their goals, advances, and incursions are all broken down via short-term and long-term, so there's not much to go in here. And the entrenchment of the critical social justice perspective, and this is their main goal. They want to have their perspective taking over the organization. And we're going to elaborate that a little bit more, but this is how we're going to be dealing with the breakdown of their methodologies. Okay, so their principles are, they always try, no matter where they go, they're always trying to evangelize for their cult. So, and where they're able to do this is whenever they're able to perceive any form of oppression within the system. So whether it be like if they walk into, like, say, our church and they see, like, oh, we don't have any black representation here, so, okay, then we're going to use that as a system of oppression, or, oh, we don't have, try not to, I'm not saying that we're so good we don't have any oppression here. I'm trying not to say anything that's going to come back and bite me later, so I'm just going to leave it at that. Okay, and then the next thing they do is they use the least amount of force necessary in their process, because they want to be able to avoid resistance. They also want to remain discreet. They don't want their initial penetration into an organization to be known, so they will only ever push as far as they can to be able to avoid any kind of spotlight on themselves. And they will also push as hard as they think the oppression within the perceived oppression within the system deserves. They view that every advance should succeed because their long-term goal is to overthrow oppressive structures. Any setback threatens to expose their goal. And then the end justifies the means. So with the entrenchment and overthrowing of the system being their ultimate goal, anything that they have to do in order to meet that goal justifies it. So even if they have to be hypocritical to their own system, which we've studied fair enough that their system is built to be hypocritical, it doesn't matter. So if they have to be oppressive themselves in order to overthrow oppression, then so be it. And we're going to go through these preliminary slides really quickly here. Okay, so why we spent the previous 9 weeks going through, or especially within the first 5 weeks going through definition after definition, was you have to be familiar with their terminologies in order to be able to identify it. Because of its insidious nature, it comes in very discreetly. So, first off is the way that woke advocates work with each other through dog whistles. We've heard this term probably on news, typically posed against non-woke people. But these are just harmless sounding words where the woke are able to identify each other, or they will be clued in on when somebody's going to problematize something. And then they also have their crossover words, which are harmless sounding words where the critical social justice definition subverts the traditional definition, such as critical, racism, diversity, equity, justice, and intersection. I know we've covered all these terms in fair depth previously, so I'm not going to go over them at this point in time. So I would say, can I get a show of hands if everybody would be familiar with the critical social justice version of these terms and to be able to compare them against the actual terms at this point? Okay, all right. I'm sorry?
I don't know how eloquent I would be. Yes.
Yeah, well, at the end of the last email I'm going to send out to the class is going to actually have a link to the Encyclopedia of Woke. There's actually somebody put together. Yeah. All right. And here is their process in action. So we call them microtactics. Okay. So the first thing that they're going to try to do in infiltrating an organization is subverting liberal decision making. So most organizations are run by some form of committee. So if you're able to break that down, you can control you can control the organization by breaking down their way of running themselves internally. So the first thing what they try to do is they try to insist on informal meetings. So no meetings where you have Roger's Rule of Order trying to run it, or you're just going to put together ad hoc meetings here or there to be able to try to alleviate perceived issues, because in that they get to control the meeting, because you don't have the rigid rules to maintain the discourse within, say, meeting minutes or something. They want to be able to steer the discourse. So they also have an aversion to secret ballot voting, because they're able to bully and coerce through consensus, like say, by using shame tactics. Hey, vote if you believe X, Y, or Z is oppressive. And nobody wants to be viewed as oppressive, so you're going to raise your hand. So that's one of the tactics they use, running down the clock. Now, this is something that's rather interesting. It's a filibustering technique. This was something that was used at the Southern Baptist Convention back in 2019 to get intersectionality and critical race theory injected into I can't even remember the term there anymore, but basically into the Southern Baptist Convention schools as a way of interpreting biblical scripture. And the way that they did this was they kept arguing off previous points. It was like I think it was a block of propositions. I think it was like 6 through 11. And they argued the point from 1 through 5, ran the clock out and said, okay, we have to vote on all these different propositions. So everybody, if you wanted to vote on, 8 or Prop 8 or Prop 10 or Prop 11, you also had to vote on Prop 9, and that way it got passed through. So little subversive tactics being used like that. So, but filibustering is you just typically, if anybody's been in politics, when you have your time on the floor, you just talk and run the clock out, or you just try to run people out of the meeting till you get only the dedicated few that stay behind. So another method that they use is they emphasize emotion and experience. They don't argue, through reason and logic. And as I was told you from the beginning of this class, you're not going to win trying to use logical arguments against the woke. They will turn them against you by stating that you're using the tools of the oppressor, but then they will always be pushing their lived experiences or very heart-wrenching emotional storytelling in order to sway people to their position, whether or not their position is logical or not. So, and then the next thing they do is they demand charity and expect none. So they will call you out anytime you say that you step out of line, or less than cordial, less than friendly, but then they will go on and run you through the mud in order to get their position forwarded. So these are basic bully tactics they use, and they use them to limit opposition and disagreement with their advances and their goals. The first thing they do is they make things awkward. They do this by not letting go of their position, by insisting that their perspective is inserted into everything you talk about, and to every material that's there. They never stop talking about it. So they basically become rather annoying, but that's part of the process, is to become very, very persistent. Okay, and then the next thing they do is ad hominem attacks. In the next series of classes, we're going to be covering this ad hominem attack in depth, but it's just an argumentation tactic where instead of dealing with the argument, they attack the person addressing the argument. So if I try to make, say, an argument on, say, racial disparities are not caused by racism, but maybe other, say, socioeconomic factors, whatever have you, instead of trying to challenge that argument on socioeconomic factors, they would say, oh, you're only saying that because you're a white oppressor, or so on and so forth. Yeah, something like that. So in no point are they actually addressing the argument. Okay, the next tactic is they assume guilt, expect proof of innocence. So you're guilty until proven innocent in their eyes. So you're already automatically an oppressor, and everybody within the organization is considered to be an oppressor as well. And the next step, they do intentional misrepresentation. I just had this one used on me the other day. They problematize the opponent's argument into a critical social justice framework. What I had happen was I was debating a gentleman. Actually, it was something that was very, very completely and utterly unrelated to anything important, but I think it was they were trying to make a talking point about something on the news, and I stated, well, I wouldn't recommend you listen to what the reporters say because they typically put a spin on it, and they're like, oh, so what makes you smarter than the journalist, they asked me, and I said, I don't claim to be smarter than the journalist by any means, but what I do, I don't watch the news. Well, what then do you do? I go to primary sources. So if this is scientific data we're looking at, I go to look for the actual scientific journals, or at least any kind of reviews of the scientific journals if I don't have access to the journals. And then this is what he said, and see if you can catch the framing here. Oh, so you do exactly what Alex Jones does. Do you know what method he tried to use there? Yeah. So if I said, yes, that's exactly what I do, then I am now grouped with Alex Jones. So it's a subtle form of misrepresentation. So little tactics like that you have to look out for. So instead of answering him yes or no, I go, really? That's a rather interesting tactic you got there. Does it ever work on anybody? I mean, are you initially trying to say that anybody who does their own research is Alex Jones? So basically you've condemned the entire scientific establishment to being a conspiracy theorist. Is that what you're trying to do? And oh, I'm just saying. And then once you get that I'm just saying, you're starting to look at that Mott and Bailey, which we're going to cover later in action. So yeah, I just had that happen to me not but a week and a half ago. Okay, next thing they do is using consensus as coercion. And that's, well, everybody else in your organization thinks this is so, or your whole family thinks this is so, or my general thing is people, or they, is going to be the thing. The next thing you do, the next bullying tactic is piling on. So where all of the woke advocates will start attacking all at once. And that becomes very tiring when it happens. And the last one is canceling. I think we're all aware of canceling, where they try to remove the person from the organization in some form, silence their voice, removing them from public discourse entirely, if at all possible.
What was piling on?
Where you have all the woke advocates coming at you at one time. So, And this is an interesting concept that's unique to this book. The author, Charles Pincourt, brought into place is, we've talked about the Mott and Bailey argument, which I'll go ahead and skip forward a little bit just so you guys can understand what the Mott and Bailey is. So the Mott and Bailey is an argumentation tactic where you have a bold, controversial claim, like everything in the West is based on systemic racism. And then if you call them out on that and you start debating their point and winning, then they come back, it's like saying, oh, I just think racism's a bad thing. And then the moment the attack subsides, then they come back down to the Bailey within the original argument again, saying racism is systemic, it's an oppressive part of society, and you're complicit in the system because you were raised in the system. Once again, you argue, oh, I'm just saying that we should treat oppressed people with care and charity, something of that nature. The I'm just saying is the clue on that. So what Pincourt, the author of this book we went through, came in is he realized it's a far more insidious tactic they used is what he calls the reverse Mott and Bailey Trojan horse, where this is defined as the Mott and Bailey strategy involves a proponent who wants to advocate a difficult to defend extreme position, which we defined as the Bailey. When or if the extreme position is challenged, the proponent retreats to an easily defensible, easily acceptable position, the Mott. The key to the strategy is the hidden false equivalency of the extreme and the easily acceptable positions. The strategy becomes a Trojan horse when the woke are able to entrench the Mott, the racism is bad kind of part, rather than systems of racism, into an organization's core statements of belief. So the Mott is typically going to be something of our company is based on diversity, equity, and inclusion. That's actually a Mott argument. The Bailey is then what we've talked about, where I think in there we have the worksheet. If you all look for a blue sheet, there's a sheet that the Smithsonian published back in 2020 talking about whiteness as being part of systemic racism. Yeah, and then that there's the Bailey right there. So we're trying to introduce diversity, inclusion, and equity into our workplace, and then that's what gets
you don't
presented.
support gay marriage, but you're a Christian, and the Bible, and you worship a God of love, basically.
Yeah, so it's going to be like a false equivalency. So
Right.
yeah, so we're just trying to say love is love,
Right.
and that be your Mott position, and the Bailey position is like. White cis heteronormativity has been oppressive to the gay culture since this masculine system, anti-gay system was put into place by Paul back in the 1st century, and then thus all Western European Christian culture is hostile towards, exactly is how it plays out. So we've covered that already. Okay, and this we got titled as the iron law of woke projection. This is another form of another process that is used within the woke when they enter into an organization, especially you're going to run into this in their meetings. So we have first process they use is called the telegraph, project, subvert, invert. And the telegraph part is a malevolent woke interpretation of a proposal. Say if you're trying to propose, let's see, I'm trying to think of something uncontroversial, but I can't think of it. Maybe I've been studying this stuff for too long. Say we want to do missions in the poorer part of town, right? So what they'll do is try to interpret that, you're trying to push your white supremacist views, your Western Christian beliefs on these poor and suspecting people. So you're trying to dominate them with your religion. So that'd be one way. Project is the next step of their methodology, which is where the malevolent interpretation is projected as being true. And when that happens, the proposal has been problematized. Like, so then the first step, like say we're trying to do missions into a poor side of town, and they're trying to say that we're trying to impose our Western oppressive religion on them. Then they go through and make a discourse on how that is true by going over, like, say, maybe bringing up the crusades, or different way that the Christian missions have tried to deculturate, like say Indian tribes, throughout in your example as well, exactly. So, and then what they do is then subvert or invert, where the proposal is used to subvert their opponent's position. And the next technique they use is by taking by moral hubris and taking the moral high ground. So they assume themselves as being morally superior to you, and that comes off very much in their language. And the only way to counter that is call them out on their hubris at that point in time. So I'm just simply saying, why do you think you have the moral high ground on this? So you're assuming that your position is more moral. Can you explain that to us? Why your position is more moral? And the more you get them to, especially within the early stages of an infiltration, the more you get them to explain themselves, the more either they're going to take the Mott and Bailey process, and then there's ways of drilling in, which we're going to get into later, but mainly you want them to talk, because the more they talk, the more they're going to expose themselves in their beliefs. So, but don't accept anything at face value. Like if I were to assume myself being morally superior to you, would you just take that at face value, or would you have me defend why I'm coming off as the moral superior to you?
Not care.
Yeah, well.
And I just walk off, but you write you off.
Well, what if their methods are counting on that exact behavior? So most people tend to be averse towards public confrontation, and the process is to take advantage of that. So the next process they use is obfuscation with technical jargon, and that is why I've been trying to teach you all this dense language, because they will bombard you with it. And they will convince other people just because they sound as if they have a huge resume in this theory. They've probably been degreed in this. They know this better than you are. They're the experts, as we've been talking about. This is the Gnosticism as they try to use. It means to confuse, to cloud up, to confuse. So and I've been using these terms. Yeah, they come in like, this is only because of, well, you saw that video with that one theologian was talking earlier before class started, but he's using long technical jargon, and most people would be like, I have no clue what he's talking about it, but it sounds official to me. It sounds highly scientific and academic, so it must be true. But most of the time, it's an intentional technique to go right over people's heads. So, and then the next thing they do is DEI is used as a cover for recruiting woke participants. So the main process of DEI within their system is not to include diversity. It's not to increase equity. It's not to increase inclusion. It is to open up the organization for more woke individuals to take place and then take over the organization. Another tactic they use is dramatic departure. The whole I'm taking my marbles and going home. Whenever you're able to call them out on their tactics and their techniques. And this is pretty much a last-ditch effort that they try to do to build up emotional support. Try to paint you, if you're trying to counter them, as the bully in the situation. So it seems very immature, but it's intentional. And then the next thing they do is a passive-aggressive opposition, which is, I don't think I really need to define that at all. Okay. All right, you have, I put in some more slides here. I'm going to say, for sake of time, so I want to be able to get us into more of a Q&A session earlier tonight. And so if you want to read these at your time frame, these are just different ways that the woke think with their cognitive distortions, with all or nothing thinking, jumping to conclusions, and how then they applying that to their mindset, to their worldview. Here's more parts of it where they use emotional reasoning, global labeling. What's interesting is categorization is something they want to eliminate, but they tend to use it to their advantage. Blowing things out of proportions with this magnifying, talking about the microaggressions, microassaults. Actually, I do want to go over that a little bit. Does anybody want to go over this chart a little bit at all? Okay, good, because this is probably better than I can write. Okay, they're all or nothing thinking, as we've been covering that they're very dualistic within their viewpoint in the world, so they're going to have everything is black or white, right or wrong. And this is manifested where if you're not part of the solution, you're part of the problem. So there's no such thing as non-racist. There's racist and anti-racist. You're either on the right or the wrong side of history. They jump to conclusions. So, and this is a very interesting argumentation tactic we're going to cover in our next apologetics course, but they want to state that they just want to protect they put words in our mouth by stating we're trying to protect our own privilege. We only care about free speech because we want to be able to insult or marginalize or oppress people. And they have a list of prescriptives that they have, these shoulds, ironclad rules of how people ought to behave, and they state that we need to do better, we need to educate ourselves, read a book, and do the work. I think you've probably all heard similar language. The emotional reason comes off, as I've told you earlier, as their lived experience and their own truth becomes the highest form of knowledge that can be used within their situations. Global labeling, so we can't label anybody, categorize anybody as anything, but they can label everybody's whiteness, white supremacy, patriarchy, toxic masculinity, and cis hetero, so on and so forth. And the blowing out of proportions, once again, is going to be tactics where they use the microaggressions, these microassaults, and we covered those to a good extent there, where they state that but they problematize everything in that. Probably one of the best examples I had happen was at work many years ago was dealing with Halloween decorations and had the word boo on it. Well, boo can be taken as an epithet towards African Americans. And I had a very, let's say, woke coworker at that point in time who tried to state I was putting in racist statements and hanging up racist statements all over. And something like that would have been considered a microaggression. So, where they also consider words as violence or harm, you hear about, we went to Walmart just the other day, me and Miranda, and a booth was set up talking about stop school violence. I had a nagging suspicion that if I drilled them on their questions, that they would have considered words as violence or harm. Miranda dragged me by my collar because she didn't want me to get in a long debate with a gentleman in front of Walmart. But nonetheless, when you hear reports of rising level of violence in our schools, it's not going to be physical violence, it's going to be verbal violence. They claim that this just for existing is going to be something like the idea of not, if we make any kind of claims against, say, homosexuality, transgenderism, then we are attacking their right to exist at that point in time. And then we've gone over that in fairly depth in previous classes, even to where it says they're trying to genocide us. So this is the blowing out of proportion, but we've talked about how they view that as a psychic death in a way, but also this is a way that they're able to use these tactics to garner more emotional support. So then the minimizing part, they try to minimize other arguments, like saying, like we try to state that the civil rights victories in the 60s were a hallmark victory of the liberal world order and able to counter racism. And they'll say black people achieve civil rights victories only when white and black interests converge. That's the central tenet of critical race theory. And then trying to say, hey, we've had a black president. Well, Obama being president changes nothing, would be another counterpoint. And then blaming, this is the opposite of personalization. And they, instead of seeing everything as your fault, all the blame is put on someone or something else. And that's typically a very much an emotional tactic. And I don't really want to get into that because it's really hard to discern and break down. So, all right. So, the main part of trying to counter these woke incursions is going to be in 3 stages. So, the first is the early stage of entrenchment, where they use subterfuge, these subtle tactics. They're minor in scale of their forcefulness, and they're used to introduce others to the critical social justice perspective. At this point in time, it's the easiest point to keep the infiltration from the organization from entrenching. And this is going to be the easiest part of just calling them out on their methods, their definitions, and the sort. Okay, by the time they get to the mid-stage entrenchment, and they typically exaggerate their support at the time. Oh, here's an interesting thing. All of this woke movement in the world is being driven by a very small minority, a less than 2% minority around the world of very highly vocal woke advocates in every organization that's able to use these tactics to steer whole corporations, whole governmental entities towards their ends. So that's why I have this exaggerating support here. So a small number of woke participants utilize woke micro tactics very vocally to make their position the most prominent within the organization. At this point, it takes a group of people to be able to counter the entrenchment. And then the late stage entrenchment, where at this point in time, they're quelling dissent. This is the grand tactic of the woke viral infection. Bullying tactics are used at this point in order to force compliance of people with their systems. At this point in time, it's basically too late for the system. If this happened to your church, your school, start looking for a new place at that point in time. Would be the only thing I would state there. All right. So moving on to the grand tactic of the woke. The primary goal of these microtactics is to ensure the eventual takeover of an organization. To state they operate like a virus is not an epithet, it is their stated methodology. The main goal is to infiltrate an organization with a false intent that seems to be of a morally good position, but once inside, their mission is to create new woke individuals. They seek to use the host organization to produce new woke viruses. To stretch that analogy, this occurs either by bringing in woke individuals or recruiting from within, but the goal is not diversity and inclusion, but compliance with the woke worldview. The woke virus uses the ethical principles of the host organization as a means to gain entry. So if you want to look at the concept of a virus as being a good analogy, and we're all familiar with what a coronavirus from COVID-19 looks like these days, where you have all those protein spikes. And those protein spikes were to be able to trick host cells into thinking that they're actual, they're non-viruses. I don't remember but they're something that the cell is normally allowing in. And from that point, once that spike touches the cell goes, oh, you're good, come on in. And then the virus injects its genetic material into the host cell. So that's exactly what happens. It uses the moral principles of organization. Within a Christian organization, it's going to be talking about God is love. Why are you opposed to our concept of love is love? So those kind of methodologies, that's why these woke words are very important to know, is those are the protein spikes that they use to enter an organization. Okay. So they use these whether through the need to address past and present grievances, which are usually a genuine area of concern, whether it be the treatment of women, the poor, or the impact humans have on the climate. The aim is to latch onto an organization's moral principles and subvert them. Okay. Now, these are the main words of warning in the process, is how to spot wokecraft before it's too late. First, take it seriously. So you're talking about just wanting to normally walk away from awkward social positions. That is one of their tactics. So you have to take it seriously that these advances are taking place. We have to be as familiar with the critical social justice perspective as possible. That's why the majority of this course has been dealing with teaching you their perspective. Because if you don't know it, it comes in so insidiously, you'll just completely be unaware. So then the word to the warning, to be vigilant, and finally watch for woke words. And that's why every single class we've gone through over the last 10 weeks has been just basically throwing a dictionary of words at you. Okay. And this is a list of common woke crossover words or dog whistles that we want to listen out for. And as I've told you, I wince whenever I hear the word critical anymore, but you have to learn to be able to discern it from their definition as to when critical can actually mean just a critique. So we've got critical, decolonization, discourse, diversity, embed, or it could be embedded, empowerment, equity, inclusion, intersection, justice, liberation, knowledge or knowledges, narrative, perspective or perspectives, privilege, race, racism, and resistance. When you hear these words, the first thing you're going to want to do is ask for what their definition is. As I told you, I had lunch with a liberation theologian about a year ago or so, where I had a feeling that they were of that bent, but I wanted to be able to not be overt in my. I didn't want to be like, oh, you're woke or anything of that nature. You want to remain charitable throughout all of our interactions. So I just let him do the talking, and he was explaining to me his frustrations with his church. And then he used the term, they just don't have an appreciation for justice. Once I heard him use that word, I knew the way it was framed, it was going to be in the critical social justice version of justice. So I asked him, I don't understand, can you define justice for me in that term? Because that doesn't seem to be used in the ways that I'm familiar with. Because it was just me and him, he just shut down, and next thing you know, all of our conversation was small talk after that point. But had it been in a group setting, and he would have either been forced to define what justice is, or he'd have used sorry, I'm tripping over words. He would have used other tactics that you would then have to call out, or use definitions to hide the definitions, the obfuscation, the technical languages, which we're going to have to get more into depth in how to handle those when they come about. But this is mainly just going to be asking people, what do you mean by that? If they start using obfuscation as a method, ask them to define that in more plain terms. And you have to be very gentle in the way you do it, and that you don't want to paint yourself as being a knuckle-dragging buffoon, but also don't want to paint yourself as being somebody who's trying to gaslight them, for lack of a better term. I don't know. That'd be a good way of stating that. Okay, and then other things to look out for are words that appear highly technical and originate in philosophy, which I use a ton of them. So yeah, you should even be putting me to the test when I use the big words, which I love to use. Words that appear to combine multiple words that are not normally associated. Trying to find where that would be. What's the word I'm looking for? There's some good definitions in the book I wanted to go over. So if you bear with me one moment, we're on slide 27. And where'd my notes go? Okay. Page 56. Whoa, we're covering some really quick ground here. There it is. Two words that don't go along together. Okay, so that's going to be binary privilege, color struck, compulsory heterosexuality, epistemic exploitation, cultural competence, meta-narrative, etc. So those are all big words, but just stuff that you don't see normally parked side by side. Okay, 3 is going to be words that have been made up, or appear to be made up, and that's dead naming, cisgender heteronormativity, minoritized. So it seems like they're just kind of pulling words out of their pocket at that point in time. Words that are spelled differently than they normally are, like Latinx, or women with an X instead of or a Y instead of an O, things of that nature. Words that describe Western society but are used in a negative sense. So typically, like the words like liberalism and modernity, stated with a snarl. Words traditionally used with a positive association in common language, but which are used negatively or derogatorily, particularly those related to Western philosophical tradition. That's going to be your logic, reason, enlightenment, so on and so forth. Said with a snarl. Words and expressions that explicitly contain references to group identity while also seeming to be invented, like whiteness, blackness, white privilege, so on and so forth, ableism, all those words I've been throwing at y'all for a while. Words and expressions that sound like bad or evil. And those would be typically crossover words that are said in a negative light, like exclusion, colonialism of the sort, and words that are opposites of crossover words. And these are going to be something like decolonization, exclusion, segregation, and desegregation of that sort. So, all right. I had to break this down to make this visible. Okay, and this is going to be more into the definition. So this is where you're asking what definitions are going to be coming into. So this is going to be dealing with Most of the resources I found were on critical race theory. I wish I could have found some on, say, like queer theory of this sort, but this will have to do for now because all their techniques operate very similarly. So when they say social justice in this terminology, they're going to mean group entitlements, and which is the reframing of particular political demands as universal moral imperatives and a denial of just rewards to individuals who follow the law. So whenever you hear the term social justice, ask them what they mean. If they give you the mot, well, I'm just trying to say that we want to be able to have a society that's going to be fair and equitable. Give them, like, well, I did some reading on this, and I found out what you're actually asking for is group entitlements, which I think is defined as the reframing of particular political demands as universal moral imperative. That's one of the things. There was a wonderful debate I wanted to bring up as a video, and I forgot to. Do we have time for that? No. I'll put it in an email, but I wanted to show you how that even that can backfire on you. So you wanted to be able to do studying, but there's anybody familiar with Bill Maher and his show? They had Ben Shapiro on and another gentleman named by the name of, I think it was Bill Vance. Bill Vance is huge into critical race theory. So Ben Shapiro, being a very astute debater, went on to the show and gave him a verbose and concise definition of critical race theory to be able to call out what this, it was J.D. Vance. No, was it J.D. Vance? No, I think I'm remembering the right character there, but last name's Vance. Is it Malcolm? Malcolm Vance, excuse me. If I'm mischaracterizing anybody, I'm sorry. But instead of doing that, he turned around the argument. So why are you so concerned about this racism thing? He started doing his projection work. And this is where it's going to be imperative that you're not going to win a debate because you're not debating. What you're trying to do is shine light out the person for who they are at that point in time. So I wanted to show you in a way how even the asking for definitions will, at first glance, seem to fail you, but you can at least get them to start playing some of their more overt pushing tactics, which expose them for what they're trying to do within the organization. Okay, we have a bunch of different other definitions of different terms, like say equity. What they mean is by that is equality of outcomes plus reparations, which is further defined as a violation of equality before the law, a dismantling of the foundations of a free society, a state management of society by redistributing resources, opportunity, and access. So I'm not going to go through all these definitions. You all have them on your notes and your handouts. So, and I'll give you the full-size versions in the email. But this is what you want to be familiarized when you hear these terms thrown at you, is you want to know the definition for when you ask them what you mean by, you can identify when they're in the Mott or the Bailey, because we're going to come on how to deal with that Mott and Bailey tactic here very shortly. Okay, so I'm just going to skip past a bit here. Or does anybody want me to go through all those different variables? Okay, good. I didn't want to go through them anyway.
I wonder, some people I hear these things from, I wonder if they can.
What that helps you do is identify who you're talking about. Are you dealing with the actual woke, or somebody who is only going with the flow in order not to lose their job? Or is it somebody who's taken this on? This sounds great. They put their black square on Instagram, the Ukrainian flag, the gay pride flag during the Obergefell decision, things of that nature, but they don't have a deep understanding of it. So these are methods also. Yes, that's a very good thing. I'm glad you pointed that. This is a way of being able to identify who you're contending with. So if you identify that they're just somebody who follows it on a very shallow level, at work, school, church, your job's not going to be too hard. But if you find out somebody who knows the counter definition, then you've got to worry. Oh, I skipped past something. Okay, sorry about that. Okay, and techniques we want to use are, if we see something, say something, we call it the woke in their game. That's the part of asking for definitions. Make them explain their position using plain language, and if they use woke words, make them define and contrast their definitions. Make them say, hey, I over here, you said the Mott definition, and you give them the definition, but over here, you said the Bailey definition. Why is that difference? Can you explain to me why we have these two different opposing positions? Okay. You remain suspicious and skeptical. Once a participant states woke talking points, Keep a discerning ear on their every word to determine whether they are woke or woke proximate. Talking about what you were saying earlier is if they just don't really take it seriously or not, but that's how you're going to find out. Okay, next is always have an alternative to propose. Best advice not to be painted as a mere negative critic, and that's one thing I'm always claiming to anybody in a meeting. If you're trying to critique somebody else, don't come in only negatively. Come in with a positive alternative, which we're going to get to later on how that's going to look. But if you come out just completely trying to dismantle somebody in public discourse, you're going to just come off looking like a jerk. And that's going to be more to the points of the woke. Okay, next point, never let them add their words, because this is a beginning of the entrenchment process. So if, next thing you know, they get everybody agreeing on the use of the word equity, the use of the word oppression in their definition, and especially if it's entrenched in everyday talk, it becomes part of the documentation of your organization. That's how they make their encroachment and continue snowballing the effect of their initiation. Okay, the next one is this is a lovely one that comes out of this Pincourt book. It's called Stealing the Mott and Bombing the Bailey. I love it. So it's recognizing the legitimacy of the Mott position, but directly challenging the Bailey position. So you're exposing the false equivalency. So we're talking about, as we talked about earlier. So stealing the Mott is you don't let them take that word diversity. No, I'm sorry, diversity doesn't mean that. Diversity means X, Y, or Z, because that's what we've commonly known it for time immemorial. Diversity means having a diverse representation of whether it be different characteristics, whether it be skin color, sexuality, opinion. But here you're sounding, this sounds very exclusive by your definition. So I think not to invoke, what do you call that movie, The Princess Bride. I don't think the word means what you think it means. Be able to demonstrate. You're not going to be able to convert the woke participant, but you're going to be able to expose to the rest of the organization that they're using subterfuge. So stealing the Mott, taking their word back, the original meaning, bombing the Bailey. Then at that point, you start dismantling their argumentation and showing it as being straight from critical theory, postmodern theory, cultural Marxism, however you want to frame it as, and being try to be more knowledgeable than they are at that point in time. But once again, going back to that Ben Shapiro interview, which I wish I would have set up beforehand, but it's a bit long, so probably didn't have the time. They're going to use other tactics, but you're going to have to be prepared for those other tactics. The next thing is co-opting woke advances is something we can do. This is my favorite part, is claiming the correctness of their Mott position, like saying, oh yeah, racism is horrible. I totally agree with you. We should do something about that. And then you turn it against them. And that's the most risky thing we can do. And we're going to cover that a little bit more, but I'm going to state this, where we turn this into apologetics, is we use that as a method to preach the gospel. I'll leave it at that for now, but we're going to get more into that later. And then make sure to vote. If you got the ability to vote in an organization, do it. Whether it be your country, your school board, our church council, so on and so forth. But we want to be able to make sure we're heard, because they will use tactics in order to suppress a vote or to get people who typically don't vote to come in and vote, to be able to skew the results and advance their propositions. So the next process, we have to identify allies, and we just talked about that earlier, is one of the outcomes in being able to force a woke participant in defining their terms is that in a meeting setting, it will typically bring in more discussion. So then you're going to be able to find out who's defending them and who's also joining you in your critique of their position, who's on your side and not. The next part is you're going to be having to make contact with these allies to find out if they're actual solid people to be able to work with, to find out if they're not either opportunists or they're just, don't want to use the term double agent, but trying to out you on the position. The next part is from contact to working together with counter-wokecraft. And this is informing each other about the critical social justice perspective. So what we're doing right here, right now, and agreeing to work together, just saying, hey, if we see this stuff coming into organization, we'll be able to tackle it together because it's going to take a concerted effort to work against. And so I don't want to spend a lot of time on this because I don't know if this is too political for the class, but this is stuff that tends to, if you're in any kind of an organization, you're going to have some sort of internal politic. And the woke takeover is part of that political process, that just subordinate the political process. So you unfortunately have to play politics within, whether it be, and I know that's been the big hot button item lately, has been the reinvigorated interest that parents have been having in taking part in their children's school board after having seen what the teachers have been teaching the students over the last 10 years, especially after COVID made that come to light when students were sent home and students were taking Zoom classes and parents were finally able to see what was happening. So, okay. I don't want to spend too much time on this section, but so we have, this talks about coordinating with allies, how we go about recruiting. I would say refer to the book on this. I really don't want to spend a lot of time here, but you're going to have to, once you see an incursion, you're going to have to identify who your allies are, or you're going to have to recruit people by basically arguing counter arguments against the talking points. You're going to have to identify sites of intervention, whether it be certain meetings, especially where there's going to be votes in place. Inform yourself of how this intervention is going to be taking place, coordinate it, prioritize which ones are most important, and making sure you have representation on your side and trying to limit representation on the other side. And this sounds very anti-liberal, but the whole woke perspective is highly anti-liberal. So, and one of the things I did want to touch, actually, it's not as bad as I thought. This was something I wanted to bring up in classes. It hit me when I was falling asleep last night. I'm fretting over talking the dreaded politics word in church, but has anybody read the book, The Autopsy of a Deceased Church by Tom Rainier? Nobody's read that book? Oh, it's a very, very short book, and it talks about typical church practices that lead towards churches dying, voting to close their doors because if they no longer have enough attendance and tithing to be able to maintain even keeping the lights on during services anymore. But it talked about how most of these churches went through their processes of not wanting to, they basically anchored on tradition over the gospel. And this tradition tended to push any kind of, let's say, dissenting voices out of the church. And the way that these church councils, in order to maintain tradition, and it could have been something as simple as maintaining the carpet in the sanctuary, whether or not the pastor used a pulpit or not, something silly like that. But you would have a church council meeting called, and say you had a large group of families that were big on let's go out and do missions, let's evangelize the community, so on and so forth, or even like just simple stuff, but biblically and doctrinally driven practices. And then you would have the people who were entrenched in the traditional way of not wanting to have their church changed, then go up and call up everybody on the church's membership log, people who haven't been to the church in years, get them to come in for a church council meeting, and then vote for their position, and then the whole issue's quashed at that point in time. So the woke will use a very similar tactic. They will garner support, misrepresent people, in order to get people on their side. Basically, straw man arguments, be able to get people in to vote, and then be able to quash any dissent. So knowing that they're going to do that, you can't sit on your hands. You also have to go out and teach of the rightness of your position. So we're talking about biblical orthodoxy against, say, this woke Gnostic infiltration of the church. Then we have to be able to educate the church on how dangerous this perspective is, like, say, whether it be progressive Christianity and that guys, like, even like, say, New Age thought infecting into the church, coming in and trying to transfer the church from within. So unfortunately, it becomes highly political. I hate to say it, but it does. I have no other things to state on that, but it seems like how far can we get away from our mission to go spread the gospel around the world to playing petty politics at a church? But if you read enough of church history, you'll know that's just basically bread and butter of the church. So I think it's just something ingrained in humanity. I don't know, we're part of God's grand plan that is of us being so political, but we are by nature. All right. So in order to counter the woke, we have to sow doubt about the critical social justice perspective. And this is let me see, where am I at? I did not do a lot of notes on here because I wanted to spare you all about all the bland reading here, but I don't remember what disarming the situation is. I do want to admit that. So that's just basically trying to counter the methods in which the woke tend to blow issues out of proportion. So disarming the situation means calming things down. They're not trying to say that we are actually explicitly racist in this church. That, yes, there's a history of racism in the nation, locally, so on and so forth. But look at what the church already does. Look, we already have people within this church who are, you don't want to tokenize. That's going to be something that's going to be used against you. But we have a strong, what? Yes, exactly. But we have a very good, solid history of being open to whatever community. They'll turn the argument against you. The woke will, but we're not trying to debate the woke at this point in time. We're trying to say, hey, our church follows a biblical view on race. And we don't view this conception of racism that they're trying to paint us out to be. And here's why. Exactly. Exactly. So, and here we have to do, the next step is equality of opportunity versus outcome. So you have to be able to paint out the difference between equality and equity, which we've covered in previous classes. We have to state that equity is too simplistic, that there's not, that's not the way to be able to end systems of oppression, is to be able to make everybody equal, erasing the distinctions, making everybody of the same socioeconomic status. That's not going to cure human nature, because if, like, say, we're able to flip a switch, everybody has the same amount in their bank accounts tomorrow. Everybody has the same type of house, same type of family, same car. Give it another 100 years, and you're going to have people who are going to be out competing each other. You'll have people that'll be rich and some people that'll be poor, just due to human nature. So the next thing, the critical social justice perspective is discriminatory by nature, and stating that white people are inherently racist, or the heterosexuals are inherently homophobic, so on and so forth. Just whatever problematization is going to be there. Inclusion begets exclusion, and that's, we talked about very early on in this class, is Herbert Marcuse's view of repressive tolerance. The idea that tolerance no longer means being tolerant of the positions, but if you're supposed to be intolerant of the intolerant, such to the point that they are completely excluded from society, which is exclusive and intolerant in nature. We will have to demonstrate the bad historical track record of the critical social justice perspective, and that's easily paintable by demonstrating the links, as we've gone through the links between the critical social justice perspective and the socialist political endeavors across the world. So be able to make the connection, like, hey, you're basically following the same worldview that drove the Soviet Union and China, which has the hugest body count of any form of autocracy across the world. Two wrongs don't make a right, fairly simple in that. We don't want to right a wrong by punishing people who don't even have anything to do with the original issue. It's the antithesis of the golden rule, and not treating people as you wish to be treated, or not demonstrating the same kind of love that we are to demonstrate to others. It restricts candidate pools which risks in lowering standards. We've talked about how the idea of diversity hiring could end up you end up having candidates apply for actually take the job that over people who are actually truly worthy of taking that job. And it runs the risk of perpetuating discrimination when that's the old adage of the reverse racism being instantiated. All right. It undermines self-confidence in qualified diverse candidates and by people thinking like I was only hired because I'm a woman or I represent this lack of diversity in the organization. Penalizing an individual for group membership, so penalizing Harry because he's a white male. Critical social justice is anti-real, anti-scientific. It goes against any kind of scientific research that has been put out on trying to alleviate racism in societies. And, okay, I don't know where I put the last one, so I'm just going to skip right over that. Okay, so, and this is a graphic that shows you the difference between inclusive and dehumanizing work that they do. So we have the concept of women, another concept of mother or girl, and instead nowadays we're seeing terms like menstruator, people with vulva, lactators, pregnant people, ovulators, birthing people, so on and so forth. Chest feeders, I think, is the craziest one being used, and
What are the words on it?
subhuman body parts, uninformed, commodity, no name, and property. So this is stuff that like actual medical organizations, whether it be hospitals or governmental organizations, are recommending doctors calling women these days, or even men have a whole series of names that they're being called. But you're seeing how this lack of their idea of being inclusive actually reduces people down to sets of properties, completely dehumanizing them. So this is the breaking down of distinctions in play here.
This is better. This dehumanizing language is better.
Yeah.
Say than just woman or mother.
Yes, as they view it as better than, like say, if you claimed, if I was a doctor and you came into my service, I couldn't assume that you're a woman. You may identify as a man. So if you're here, like say, say you're pregnant again.
You can't assume that I'm a woman.
Yeah. So I would have to say, instead of like calling you a woman, I would have to call you as a birthing person or uterus haver in order not to offend you by misgendering you. This is something that can get a doctor's medical license revoked, is misgendering in many nations, and I'm pretty sure it's not quite to that extent in the U.S., but it will be soon. Okay. I'm going to skip over some of these parts because this is the political part. So that's the idea of how the woke infiltrate is they deformalize meetings. So what we want to do is we formalize meetings. The way to do that is you have to volunteer to chair these meetings if nobody wants to. You have to make sure voting procedures are in place, make sure there's an agenda and everybody sticks to it, and establish the agenda beforehand. So we basically have to follow Roger's Rule of Order. And you think, why do we have to follow these rigid rules of meeting orders that have been around for centuries to operate this parliamentary system? Well, it's because human nature is human nature, and this processes of, it protects people against the minority from oppressing the majority. Hey, we assign times and agenda items. We stick to the agenda. We close or decide to table propositions. We identify relevant documents in the agenda, and we record and circulate minutes. Oh, thank you for that, Miss Evelyn, for all your hard work in doing that.
I'm tired.
Oh, Dr. Miranda,
19 years.
Miranda loves doing that kind of stuff, in case you ever... Okay. We want to allow anonymous input into these... anonymous input is a way of getting around the bullying tactics, the consensus tactics, and the piling on tactics that the woke use. We want to allow for secret ballot voting ideals, and that's one of the things I see as a weakness is when you're in a group setting, you tend to want to vote for the consensus, or you don't want to take the unpopular position. So a lot of people will vote to the consensus if there's a lack of secret ballot voting. So I'm not going to get into how to institute secret ballot voting. If you haven't read the book, read the book. Okay, now here's where I'm going completely off of all this stuff. And I'm done with the book. So That's so we're into, these are my words here completely. So this is my advice to you all. Christian principles for countering woke culture. First, make them define their terms. And I know I've covered this in an extent before, but I want to keep drilling this into your head. The woke crossover words are often drawn from Christian moral principles in name, but not in deed, like the misrepresentation of terms love, justice, even the idea of liberation can be changed. The next step they use is by forcing the woke, that we use is by forcing the woke to define their terms. You force them then to have to explain the false equivalency of the Motte-and-Bailey, which we covered earlier, especially as I was talking to you about that theologian I talked to a year ago, where he tried to get me into that Motte-and-Bailey with the term justice, so I made him define his terms. Couldn't move any further forward there. And this tactic also demonstrates to others the duplicitous nature of the woke tactics. As I said, we're not going to be able to win over the woke in any of this apologetical discourse. And this is where it's going to be seeing, well, where is this apologetic? We're working towards that. But the apologetics is we're actually trying to shine light on the methods that the enemy is using. When I say enemy, I mean Hasatan, the deceiver, in this point, to make his methods known to others so that they may be able to identify for what it is, distance himself if need be, or to be able to engage alongside with you. So, but as I said, that's the main goal of most apologetics. In our discourse with an atheist, more often than not, you are not going to be able to convince an atheist one iota of your position. They may demonstrate charity in your debate, but they're not your audience. Your audience are the people listening in on your debate. So this doesn't change at all in our work against the woke, excuse me. Okay, next step. We reject their advances to subordinate Scripture. And this is what we see a lot. I think I've shown you enough of the different ways in which progressive Christians, woke churches, so on and so forth, have subordinated Scripture, push forward their critical social justice needs. So many progressive Christians and woke activists will seek to use Scripture where their woke crossover words will change the orthodox meaning of the text. So it's important then to learn hermeneutics, which is the science of scriptural interpretation. So I'm saying you need to acquire the ability to demonstrate that Scripture does not stand alone. So typically a lot of ways this is done is like the woke will use a single line of Scripture. So the typical is going to be for God 3:16, John 3:16, for God so loved the world. We all know these single scriptures that are used out of context. They're able to paint the actual words that the author was trying to say in a complete different light. And here, in this, every preacher, every pastor, every theologian is going to tell you this: context is key. We have to take the Scripture within greater context of the passage, of the book, and of the genre. Okay. And in learning hermeneutics, it gives you the ability to discern heretical theological interpretations of Scripture. And I am as bold to state that liberation theology is absolutely heretical. It's Gnostic by nature. And because of most of the language is very Christianese, it's very hard for us to detect when it comes in. So this is a plug for Pastor Mike's Christian Doctrine class starting this Sunday. I would highly recommend it. If y'all don't have a grounding in theology, it'd be able to help you learn the spot orthodox from non-orthodox thinking. Okay, our goal is also to co-opt, and this is my favorite part, co-opt woke advances to spread the gospel. So most woke advances are centered around addressing issues of injustice and oppression, and this is basically the Christian version of stealing the Motte and bombing the Bailey. So instead of appealing to the critical social justice views on justice, we have the ability to proclaim God's justice and mercy as well as the oppressive consequences of sin. So instead of saying, hey, I really like this talk about justice you're bringing up, but I don't quite agree with your definition here. See, within Christianity, we have this idea of justice as being, of God being the ultimate judge. And his goal of his justice is to bring and restore humanity to him. Who is it that this form of justice that you're using is trying to restore the people who are going to be the recipients of justice to? To themselves? To society? Here we actually have an ens domine where a person will be restored to God and thus be able to live out an eternity in God's holy presence. And you see what I'm doing here. So you're turning around their advance, stealing the mop and bombing the Bailey with the gospel. And the next thing you want to do is proclaim that the church has been active in fighting injustice and oppression for millennia. Or instead of trying to, you don't necessarily have to paint out the critical social justice perspective as being inherently evil, which you can do, but instead saying, we've already been doing this for millennia, which they're probably going to try to paint the church in a bad light. But then that's why I have been so vehemently trying to demonstrate to you all that the critical social justice perspective is actually a modern form of Gnosticism and Hermeticism, because this is a bit of a risky take that you might have to do at work at some point in time. But once they start attacking Christianity or Western Christian principles, you have to first distance Orthodox Christianity from their misrepresentation by being able to demonstrate, yes, the church has its sins throughout history. There's been religious wars. Yes, there's been people fighting over doctrinal differences. First, paint the Christian doctrine helped to end slavery. It brought women out of the actual patriarchy that happened in the Roman Empire at that point in time, and actually brought them to a more equal status than they ever had before that point in time. What has your position ever done? And then your position leads to the Soviet Union and China, where you have over 50 million deaths within just the way the governments mismanage and oppress their own people through famine and killing people within political prisoners within gulags and the sort. Do we have an issue here with human nature? Or is your concept coming that you're just? This is where I was like, I would want to say your position is just as religious as mine, but you're trying to paint mine. My body count is nowhere near your body count. If you're wanting to state that you're coming from a higher point, for one, and then number two, where was I going with this? Excuse me. But yeah, I don't think I want to continue down that path, but just you're seeing where I'm using the arguments against them. I'm trying to go how I would parry back and forth, because you're going to not have you're not going to have the pulpit at the whole time to be able to present your position, so you're going to have to go back and forth. So you have to choose your arguments wisely, depending on your audience and your interlocutor. But so yeah, learn to turn their methods against them. Which is, if you've known from taking my previous classes, is my favorite method of argumentation. So, okay. And the next thing is recruit the woke participants for the kingdom of God. The ability to engage in dialogue with those forwarding the Christian social justice worldview is an opportunity for evangelization. So the same counter arguments we have towards the woke worldview are arguments for Christ. So I want to state many of the most fervent defenders of the faith began as the worst detractors, like Paul and Augustine, people who were actively engaged against Christianity, more so Paul than Augustine. And the purpose of dialoguing to the woke is to provide a defense of the Christian faith, which is the foundation of all apologetics. And I have another whole section in here, which I'm gonna, I don't know, let's see, yeah, we've got 10 slides. This is going to be more in dealing with the woke culture in your workplace. I didn't think I was gonna be able to get to this, so we're gonna go over it. So, remind yourself right now of the following truth: you're free. We indeed live in a strange time in which opinions and beliefs on the wrong thing can bring untold consequences, but giving in to those who seek to confine you only hurts you in the long term. Your loss of personal integrity is the most significant thing that can be taken from you. Don't give it up for anything. So this is going to be basically a pep talk on how to be brave in this time frame. 2, be honest. Do not say anything about yourself or others that you know is false. Absolutely refuse to let your mind be colonized by these woke terminologies. The first crazy thing someone asks you to believe or profess, refuse it. If you can, do so out loud. There's a good chance it will inspire others to speak up too. 3, stick to your principles. If you're a decent person, you know mob justice is never just. Never join a mob even if you agree with the mob. If you are a decent person, you know betraying friends is wrong. If a friend or a colleague does something you disagree with, address them privately. Do not use the woke tactics against them. Any mob that comes for them will come for you. 4, set an example for your kids in your community. This means being courageous. This is hard, it's really hard, but in other times and places, including in our own nation, people have made far greater sacrifices. If enough people display courage, we'll be able to take on this beast in unanimity. So if you don't like it, leave it. This is what I talked about. This is the point where you know you're in an entrenched organization, whether it be in a class, a college, a job, etc. Do not be afraid to leave your school, your job, your church, etc. The impulse to want to change things from within is possible before the organization is completely subsumed. And by all means, try as hard as you can. But if the organization is completely subsumed, it is time to dust off your feet and move to a less hostile environment. And 6, become more self-reliant. If you can learn to use a power drill, do it. If you always wanted an outdoor solar hot tub, make one. Learn to poach an egg or shoot a gun. Most importantly, realize that organizations are not neutral. To the extent that you can build your own life to be self-reliant and not 100% reliant on any one corporation, school, or government agency to provide for you, Christianity changed the world through smaller, more organic communities. So this is trying to compel people to form smaller, more organic communities, not have to rely on large organizations we've had to deal with. So 7, worship God more than organizations. In other words, do not lose sight of what is essential. Professional prestige is not essential. Being popular is not essential. Getting your child into an elite preschool is not essential. Doing the right thing is essential. Telling the truth is essential. Protecting your kids is essential. 8, make like-minded friends, then stand up for them. 2 good tests. Are they willing to tell the truth even if it hurts their own side? And do they think that one should never compromise their core convictions, no matter how bleak the circumstances? These people are increasingly rare, so when you find them, cherish them. 9, trust your own eyes and ears. Rely on first-hand information from people you trust rather than on the media, your workplace, or your school. When you hear someone making generalizations about a group of people, imagine they're talking about you and react accordingly. If people insist on spouting back headlines and talking points, make them prove their position in their own words. And then 10, use your capital to build original, interesting, and generative things right now. Every day I hear from those with means, with children at private schools who are being brainwashed, people who run companies where they're scared of their own employees, people who donate to their alma mater even though it betrays their principles. You have the ability to build new things. If you don't have the financial capital, you have the social or political capital, or the ability to sweat. The work of our lifetimes is the great build. The concept of building a parallel economy, if need be, in order to counter the advances of the woke. So that's basically it. I told you it was going to be really short. So I don't know, do you all have any questions about everything? Any concepts that you want to cover again before we end the class? Any concepts we want to go over? Because I know this was 9 weeks of build-up to have a very short apologetical end. The reason is it would take another 10 weeks to teach you all the argumentation. Well, guess what? 10 weeks, we're going to be learning all the argumentation, but it's going to be general debate tactics. So starting on the 27th, about like 3 weeks from now, we'll be teaching the next class. So this is going to be applied apologetics. So what we're going to be doing is we're going over this study guide here. It's a Christian apologist named Greg Kuchel. So it's this book called Tactics. So this is actual using argumentation as a tactic to be able to spread the gospel, but also how to do so in a method that demonstrates Christian charity. Also, I'm going to be adding in my own debate tactics here on top of what we're going to be doing. I'm also going to teach you debate skills, all the debate methods, so you'll be able to know them when you see them. In essence, you saw that we got the chess motif going on. I mean, you had it in my announcements. is I want you to be able to see all the different moves that you can do on the chessboard, be able to identify them when you see them, and to be able to know how to counter with your own parry at that point in time. So one last offer. Any questions concerning anything we've covered in this class? Nobody? Nobody?
I think it was very digestible. What is the a lot of the tactics kind of Gnostic. I could be wrong, but it looked a lot like those like TikTok ones.
Like what? I'm sorry?
Like cheap and narcissism. Like 10 signs the person you're dealing with is a narcissist.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, there's been studies on the correlation between narcissistic personality disorder and general sociopathy and people who fall into the woke social activist crew. They're highly correlatable. Yeah, go and cut it. Thank you, Harry. So,
That's not an actual question, but it's just something.
Push the new live button there.
yeah, it should be the red button. I hope we got it. Yeah, so a lot of the same tactics you would use to diffuse, say, a narcissist or sociopath would work well in